My daughter smiled brightly as she handed her father-in-law a $20,000 Mediterranean cruise ticket. Then she turned, her smile faltering just a fraction, and slid a crumpled $5 lottery ticket across the table to me. She smirked, her voice carrying over the clinking glasses of the upscale restaurant, and told me that my bad back could not handle a real vacation anyway. I simply smiled, tucked the cheap piece of paper into my worn suit pocket, and said thank you. She did not know that cheap piece of paper was about to win $190 million, and she certainly did not know it would buy the perfect revenge to destroy her husband's fake empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is George Baxter. I am 71 years old, and my life in the Chicago suburbs was built on calluses, motor oil, and silent sacrifices. For 40 years, I worked as a mechanic. My hands are permanently stained with the grease of 1,000 engines, a physical testament to a lifetime of providing. When my wife Diane passed away a decade ago, my entire world shrank down to our daughter, Stephanie. Diane and I had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world outside of our quiet neighborhood, but every spare dollar we earned went into the Stephanie Fund. I wanted her to have the life we never could. I worked double shifts, sometimes taking night jobs at a local distribution warehouse just to ensure she could graduate from university debt-free. When she got married, I drained the last of my savings to put the down payment on her first house. I gave her everything, emptying my own cup so hers could overflow. I lived in a modest, two-bedroom apartment filled with old oak furniture and the lingering memory of Diane's lavender perfume. I drank cheap black coffee, drove a car that was old enough to vote, and never asked for a single thing in return. I thought that was what a good father did. I thought she understood the weight of what I had given up. I was wrong. The reality of my daughter's gratitude became painfully clear on Father's Day. I spent an hour getting ready that evening, carefully pressing the only good suit I owned. It was a dark navy two-piece I had bought 8 years ago for a funeral. It was a little loose on my aging frame, and the lapels were hopelessly out of style, but it was clean and respectable. I drove my '28 Ford sedan into the city, navigating the heavy Chicago traffic, until I reached the Prime Cut Steakhouse. It was one of those suffocatingly pretentious downtown restaurants, where the valet looks at your car like it is a disease, and the menus do not have prices printed on them. Stephanie had picked the venue, insisting we do a joint dinner to celebrate both me and Justin's father. Justin was my son-in-law, a flashy, arrogant real estate developer who wore custom-tailored suits and treated everyone around him like an employee. He was obsessed with appearances, driven by a desperate need to project wealth he did not actually possess. His father, Lawrence, was a retired corporate executive. Lawrence was genuinely wealthy, but he was famously stingy, a cold, calculating man who believed affection was a transaction and everyone else was a bad investment. Stephanie idolized him. She bent over backward to fit into their elitist world, adopting their mannerisms, their snobbery, and their blatant disregard for people they deemed beneath them. That included me. When I walked into the dimly lit, mahogany-paneled dining room, I spotted them at a large corner booth. Stephanie was wearing a designer dress that cost more than my monthly pension. Justin was leaning back, flashing his heavy gold watch, while Lawrence held court at the head of the table with a glass of expensive scotch in his hand. I approached the table with a warm smile, hoping for a pleasant evening. Stephanie stood up and gave me a stiff, awkward side hug, careful not to wrinkle her dress. Justin offered a firm, practiced handshake that felt entirely hollow, looking past me to flag down a waiter. Lawrence barely acknowledged my arrival, giving me a dismissive nod before taking another sip of his drink. I took my seat at the far end of the table, feeling immediately like an intruder at my own celebration. The dinner dynamics were exhausting. For 2 hours, I sat in silence while Justin and Lawrence dominated the conversation. Justin bragged incessantly about his latest commercial development project, throwing around buzzwords about leverage, equity, and market dominance. He spoke loudly, making sure the neighboring tables could hear just how important he was. Lawrence, meanwhile, spent the evening critiquing everything. He complained about the temperature of the room, the quality of the appetizers, and the attentiveness of our waiter. Despite his massive wealth, he scrutinized the bill when the drinks arrived, complaining about the markup, and then came the passive-aggressive jabs directed at me. Lawrence looked down his nose at my plate of simple roasted chicken, adjusting his expensive silk tie. He asked me how the fixed-income life was treating me, his tone dripping with condescension. He suggested that if I had managed my money better in my youth, I would not be living in such a cramped apartment in my twilight years. Justin chimed in, making a cruel joke about the frayed cuffs of my suit jacket, asking if I had borrowed it from a museum. I looked at Stephanie, expecting my daughter to defend me, to remind them that my money was gone because it had paid for the very education that allowed her to sit at this table. Instead, she laughed along with them. She covered her mouth and giggled, her eyes darting to Lawrence to make sure he approved of her amusement. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. She was not just trying to fit in. She was actively ashamed of me. I swallowed the lump in my throat, cut a piece of my chicken, and remained the quiet, observant patriarch. I absorbed their disrespect, burying my anger deep down to keep the peace, just as I always did. As the waiter cleared our dessert plates, the atmosphere shifted. It was time for the gifts. Stephanie stood up, her face glowing with a manufactured adoration that she never directed at me anymore. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a heavy cream-colored envelope sealed with gold wax. She walked over to Lawrence and handed it to him, with a rehearsed speech about how he was an inspiration, a pillar of success, and the true patriarch of their family. Lawrence opened the envelope with agonizing slowness. Inside was a voucher for an all-expenses paid first-class Mediterranean cruise, a $20,000 vacation. Lawrence smiled, a rare, genuine expression of satisfaction, and nodded his approval. Justin beamed with pride, patting his father on the back. Then Stephanie turned to me. The glowing smile vanished, replaced by a tight, obligatory line across her face. She reached into her bag again and pulled out a cheap, bent greeting card. It looked like she had grabbed it from a gas station on the drive over. She slid it across the white tablecloth. It stopped right in front of my water glass. I picked it up. The card had a generic picture of a golf bag on the front. Inside, there was no handwritten note, no message of love or gratitude. There was only a single brightly colored piece of paper fluttering out onto the table. It was a $5 Mega Millions quick pick lottery ticket. The table went entirely silent. I looked from the ticket up to my daughter's eyes, searching for a hint of a joke, a sign that this was a mistake. Instead, Stephanie smirked. She looked at Justin, then at Lawrence, and announced loudly enough for the waiter filling our water glasses to hear. "You do not like traveling anyway, Dad. Your back could not handle a real trip. Figured maybe you will finally get lucky instead." Lawrence chuckled, a low, cruel sound that echoed in my ears. Justin let out a sharp laugh, shaking his head, as if my poverty was the funniest punchline he had ever heard. They looked at me, waiting for my reaction, waiting for me to act like the grateful, pathetic old man they believed me to be. I looked down at the $5 ticket. I thought about the night shifts at the warehouse. I thought about the freezing Chicago winters spent under the hoods of broken-down cars to pay for her textbooks. I thought about the house she lived in, paid for by my sweat. I did not cause a scene. I did not yell, and I did not throw the ticket back in her face. I simply picked up the cheap piece of paper, folded it carefully, and placed it securely into the breast pocket of my outdated suit. I looked my daughter dead in the eye, gave her a polite, empty smile, and said, "Thank you." I sat there for the remainder of the evening, in calculated silence, knowing that the string tying my heart to her approval had just been permanently severed. The rain beat against the thin glass of my living room window that Tuesday night. It was a cold, relentless drizzle that washed over the quiet Chicago suburb, matching the dull ache in my chest. 2 days had passed since that dinner at the steakhouse. 2 days since my own daughter looked at me with pity and handed me a $5 lottery ticket like I was a beggar on the street. I had not spoken to Stephanie since. I had not spoken to anyone. My apartment was painfully silent, save for the hum of the old refrigerator and the ticking of the grandfather clock Diane and I had bought at a flea market 30 years ago. I sat in my worn-out recliner nursing a mug of decaffeinated coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. My navy blue suit still hung on the back of a dining chair, where I had left it Sunday night. I had not bothered to put it away. It felt like a monument to my humiliation. I stared at the frayed cuffs Justin had mocked. I thought about Lawrence and his $20,000 cruise. But mostly I thought about Stephanie's smirk, the way she giggled when they humiliated me. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room, and walked over to the suit. I reached into the breast pocket and pulled out the cheap, brightly colored piece of paper. The quick pick ticket. It felt flimsy between my calloused fingers. A meaningless scrap of paper born from disrespect. I walked over to the small kitchen table and smoothed the ticket out under the harsh glow of the overhead light. I almost threw it away. I hovered my hand over the trash can, ready to discard the physical reminder of my daughter's cruelty. But 40 years of working as a mechanic had wired a stubborn sense of routine into my brain. You check the oil, you check the tire pressure, you check the ticket. It was just habit. I pulled my reading glasses out of my shirt pocket and rested them on the bridge of my nose. I picked up my old smartphone, tapping the cracked screen to wake it up. I searched for the local lottery website. The page loaded slowly, the blue and yellow graphics appearing line by line. The jackpot for the Mega Millions had been rolling over for weeks, climbing higher and higher, until it reached an astronomical sum. $190 million, a number so large it felt entirely disconnected from reality. It was a number for people like Lawrence or the people Justin pretended to be, not for a retired man living in a rent-controlled apartment. The winning numbers from that night's draw were displayed in bold black text across the top of the screen. I looked down at my ticket. I took a sip of my cold coffee and looked at the first number on my screen. 12. I glanced at the first number printed on my flimsy ticket. 12. A small coincidence, I thought. It happens. I looked back at the screen for the second number. 28. I moved my eyes down to the ticket. 28. My chest tightened just a fraction. Two numbers meant nothing really, but the statistical improbability made my old heart flutter. I rubbed my eyes, taking off my glasses and wiping them on my shirt before putting them back on. I read the third number on the website. 39. I looked at the ticket. 39. The air in my small kitchen suddenly felt very thin. The hum of the refrigerator seemed to fade away, leaving a ringing silence in my ears. 3 numbers. I had matched 3 numbers. My hands started to tremble. The same hands that had rebuilt transmissions and carried my wife's coffin were now shaking over a piece of paper. I forced myself to look at the fourth number. 48. I squeezed my eyes shut, took a breath, and opened them to look at the ticket. 48. I stood up from the chair, knocking it backward. It scraped loudly against the linoleum floor. This was impossible. This was a cruel trick of my aging mind. I was misreading the screen. I was looking at an old draw. I refreshed the page on my phone, my thumb slipping on the glass. The page reloaded. The numbers remained the same. I braced my hands on the kitchen table, leaning my weight over the ticket. The fifth number on the screen was 57. I stared at the ticket for what felt like an eternity before letting my eyes focus on the fifth circle. 57. I stopped breathing. 5 numbers. I had matched all 5 numbers. My mind raced, trying to calculate the odds, trying to find the flaw in the universe. But there was one number left. The Mega Ball. The final lock on the vault. The Mega Ball number on the screen was 18. I closed my eyes. I thought about Diane. I thought about the night shifts at the warehouse. I thought about the down payment on Stephanie's house. I thought about the crumpled greeting card sliding across the white tablecloth at the steakhouse. I opened my eyes and looked at the final number on my ticket. 18, 12, 28, 39, 48, 57. Megaball 18. I fell back a few steps, hitting the kitchen counter. My legs completely gave out beneath me, and I slid down the cabinets until I was sitting on the cold floor. I pulled my knees to my chest, clutching the ticket in my fist. I looked around my small, modest apartment. The peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the leaking faucet in the sink. Nothing had changed, but everything was different. I was holding $190 million. The realization set in like a tidal wave crashing over me. The sheer gravity of it crushed the breath from my lungs. $190 million. It was more money than Justin could ever borrow. It was more money than Lawrence had earned in his entire lifetime. It was absolute, undeniable power. The kind of power that could buy entire city blocks, that could rewrite history, that could level mountains. I sat on the kitchen floor for an hour, staring at the wall. I did not cry. I did not cheer. A profound, heavy stillness settled over my soul. The frail old man who sat quietly taking insults at a steakhouse died on that kitchen floor. In his place, a new man was born. A man with the resources to demand respect, to enforce consequences, to adjust the balance of the world. My daughter had given me this ticket as a joke. She had tossed it to me like a bone to a stray dog. She thought it was the price of my humiliation. She was wrong. It was the price of my absolute freedom. I sat on the cold linoleum floor for a long time, just breathing in the quiet air of my apartment. The shock slowly faded, leaving behind a strange, buzzing energy in my veins. My first instinct, the one I had relied on for 35 years, was to share my joy with my daughter. Whenever anything good happened in my life, whether it was a small raise at the mechanic shop or finding a rare coin at a yard sale, I always called Stephanie. I lived to hear her voice light up. I lived to feel like I was bringing some small piece of happiness into her world. It was a reflex built into my bones. My hand moved almost on its own, reaching for the phone resting on the kitchen table above me. My thumb hovered over her name in my contacts list. I closed my eyes and imagined the call. I pictured the phone ringing in her large house. I could almost hear the annoyance in her voice when she saw my name on the caller ID, late on a Tuesday night. But then I would tell her we were rich. I imagined the gasp she would let out. I could perfectly picture the sudden frantic shift in her tone. The annoyance would vanish, and in its place a manufactured explosive joy would erupt. She would call for Justin. Justin would run into the room, and his usual arrogance would be replaced by desperate, fawning attention. They would drive over immediately. They would burst through my door with hugs and tears and promises of how we would spend our lives together. Lawrence would probably invite me to his country club the very next morning. They would finally treat me like I mattered. My thumb lingered over the screen, but I did not press call. I opened my eyes and looked at the cracked glass of my phone. I looked down at the lottery ticket resting in my other hand. The cold reality of that imagined phone call washed over me like ice water. They would not be hugging me. They would be hugging $190 million. Justin would not respect me. He would respect the capital I could inject into his failing real estate developments. Stephanie would not love me any more than she did 2 days ago. She would simply love the absolute financial security I could provide. I thought about her smirk at the steakhouse. I remembered the exact way she slid that cheap piece of paper across the table, knowing it was an insult. She did not do it because she was careless. She did it because she wanted to perform for her husband and her father-in-law. She wanted to prove to them that she was above her working-class roots. She wanted to show them that she viewed her own father with the same disdain they did. If I called her now, I would be rewarding that exact behavior. I would be paying them for their cruelty. I would be purchasing their affection. All my life, I believed that if I just gave enough, she would appreciate me. I believed that if I sacrificed my own comfort, my own dreams, and my own financial security, she would eventually see my worth. I thought love was a debt she would someday repay with kindness. But looking at her name on my phone, I finally understood the truth. You cannot buy respect from people who measure human value by a bank account balance. If I gave them this money, I would not be saving my family. I would be feeding a monster. Justin would squander it on flashy investments to feed his ego. Lawrence would take credit for advising us. Stephanie would use it to buy her way into a society that fundamentally despises people like me. And I would go right back to being the quiet, invisible old man, only this time I would be a quiet, invisible old man funding their arrogance. I thought about Diane. My beautiful, practical wife had always been sharper than me when it came to human nature. In her final months, when the sickness had confined her to this very apartment, she used to hold my hand and warn me. She told me I was giving Stephanie too much rope. She told me that shielding our daughter from every hardship was not building her character, but erasing her empathy. I never wanted to believe Diane was right. I wanted to believe that boundless generosity would create boundless love. But Diane knew that unearned privilege only breeds entitlement. Standing in my kitchen tonight, I finally admitted that my wife had been right all along. I had spent 15 years watering a garden of weeds. I slowly lowered my phone. The desperate need for my daughter's approval, the invisible chain that had dragged me through decades of exhaustion, simply snapped. I felt it break inside my chest. It was not a violent rupture, but a quiet, clean severing. The father who would have broken his own back to see her smile evaporated. A deep, absolute calm took his place. I turned the phone off completely. The screen went black, reflecting my own face back at me. I looked different. The lines around my eyes seemed less like marks of fatigue and more like scars of survival. I realized that keeping this secret was the most powerful thing I could ever do. Silence was my shield. Silence was my weapon. By saying nothing, I was taking back every ounce of control I had surrendered to them over the years. They thought I was a fragile mechanic whose best days were behind him. They thought I was a pathetic stepping stone they had successfully crossed. Letting them continue to believe that was the ultimate advantage. I stood up from the floor. My knees did not pop this time. I felt remarkably steady. I folded the lottery ticket with precise, deliberate movements and slid it into a plastic sandwich bag. I walked into my bedroom and placed the bag inside an old metal lockbox I kept at the bottom of my closet, hidden beneath a stack of heavy winter sweaters. I closed the lid and turned the key, hearing the satisfying click of the locking mechanism. I walked over to the window and looked out at the street below. The rain had stopped, leaving the asphalt slick and reflective under the amber glow of the streetlights. Somewhere in the city, Justin and Stephanie were probably sleeping, surrounded by luxury goods they bought on credit. They lived loud, chaotic lives driven by the constant, exhausting need to prove their worth to people who did not care about them. I used to pity them for that pressure. I used to want to save them from it. Now I realized they deserved that prison. They built it themselves. I turned away from the window. The silence of my apartment wrapped around me like a thick, protective blanket. I was completely invisible to the world. No one knew the power that rested in the bottom of my closet. I was a ghost walking among them, holding the keys to the kingdom. I would go about my routine tomorrow. I would drink my cheap coffee and wear my faded clothes. I would smile politely at my neighbors. But underneath that familiar shell, the old George Baxter was gone. The man who woke up tomorrow would be a strategist. The calculated silence I embraced tonight was just the first move in a very long game. Wednesday morning arrived with a clear sky and the familiar rumble of the garbage trucks outside my apartment. I woke up exactly at 6 a.m, just as I had for the last 40 years. I did not rush. I made my cheap instant coffee and ate a slice of dry toast. Everything had to remain exactly the same. I dressed in my usual beige windbreaker and a pair of faded denim jeans. I took the plastic sandwich bag containing the ticket from my metal lockbox and carefully placed it into the inside pocket of my jacket, keeping it pressed close to my heart. I walked to the corner and waited for the city bus to downtown Chicago. The ride took 45 minutes. I sat near the back watching the city pass by through the scratched window. It was a surreal experience. I was riding a public bus surrounded by exhausted commuters, college students listening to music, and tired mothers trying to quiet their children. I blended in perfectly. I was just another invisible old man clutching a worn leather wallet. None of them knew that the man sitting quietly in the back row was currently carrying a piece of paper worth $190 million. The sheer absurdity of it made me want to laugh, but I kept my face entirely blank. I had work to do. When I stepped off the bus into the bustling downtown financial district, I was surrounded by towering glass skyscrapers and men in suits that cost more than my car. I walked past the flashy high-profile law firms with their massive gold-lettered signs and marble lobbies. Justin always talked about those firms. He idolized the lawyers who threw their names on billboards and bought courtside tickets to basketball games. Those lawyers were loud and desperate for attention. That was the absolute last thing I needed. I needed a ghost. I needed someone whose entire reputation was built on impenetrable silence and absolute ruthlessness. I found the address I was looking for in a much older, understated limestone building tucked away on a quieter side street. The directory simply listed Richard Sullivan Estate Law on the 4th floor. There was no grand reception area, just a solid oak door with a small brass nameplate. I walked in and was greeted by a serious-looking receptionist who asked if I had an appointment. I told her I did not, but that I needed to speak with Mr. Sullivan regarding an estate matter of extreme urgency. She looked at my faded windbreaker with a hint of skepticism, but asked me to wait. 10 minutes later, was ushered into a modest but impeccably organized office. Richard Sullivan sat behind a heavy mahogany desk. He was a man in his late 50s with sharp, calculating eyes, a neatly trimmed gray beard, and a demeanor that completely lacked any artificial warmth. He did not offer me coffee or make small talk about the weather. He simply pointed to the leather chair across from him and asked how he could assist me. He assumed I was there to draft a simple will or settle a small life insurance policy. I sat down and looked him squarely in the eyes. I told him I needed absolute total anonymity and ironclad asset protection against family members who might try to contest my estate. He nodded slowly, taking a notepad from his drawer. He asked about the approximate value of the assets we would be protecting. I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket. I pulled out the plastic bag and laid the lottery ticket flat on the center of his mahogany desk. I told him the asset was currently valued at $190 million before taxes. Mr. Sullivan did not gasp. He did not jump out of his chair or shout in disbelief. That is how I knew I had hired the exact right man. He leaned forward, picking up the plastic bag by the very edge and examined the numbers. He looked at his computer monitor, verified the numbers from the previous night, and then looked back at me. The air in the room shifted. The polite disinterest vanished entirely, replaced by a terrifyingly sharp, professional focus. He folded his hands on the desk and told me that my life as I knew it was over, and that if we did not move immediately, I would become a target for every scammer, relative, and predator in the country. I told him I already knew who the predators were, and that I needed a fortress to keep them out. Mr. Sullivan went to work. For the next 3 hours, we sat in that office constructing a legal armor so dense no one could ever pierce it. He explained that Illinois law allowed lottery winners to claim their prizes through a trust to maintain their anonymity. My name would never appear on a giant cardboard check. It would never be printed in a newspaper. The public would only ever know the name of the trust. He asked me what I wanted to name it. I thought about the steakhouse. I thought about Stephanie sliding that card across the table. But then I thought about the woman who had warned me about all of this long before it happened. The woman who had truly loved me. I told him to name it the Diane Baxter Memorial Trust. Saying her name out loud in that context felt like a profound honoring of her memory. She was finally going to get the legacy she deserved. Mr. Sullivan drafted the preliminary paperwork with ruthless efficiency. He explained the tax implications, the required waiting periods, and the steps we would take to quietly transfer the funds into secure, diversified accounts. He became my general, preparing for a war only the two of us knew was coming. By the time I signed the final document designating him as the legal representative of the trust, my hands were no longer shaking. I left the office just as the afternoon clouds began to clear. I did not feel rich. I felt dangerous. I walked back to the bus stop, merging once again into the sea of ordinary people. The ticket was no longer in my pocket. It was locked in a reinforced safe in a secure building protected by a man who made his living destroying anyone who tried to breach his contracts. My arsenal was secured. The quiet, grieving mechanic was officially gone. I boarded the bus and rode back to the suburbs, ready to watch my daughter and her husband walk blindly into the trap they had set for themselves. While I was riding the city bus back to my quiet suburban apartment, secure in the knowledge that my future was completely bulletproof, a very different kind of reality was crashing down on my son-in-law across town. I would not piece together the exact timeline until weeks later. But that Wednesday afternoon was the beginning of the end for Justin and his imaginary empire. Justin had built his entire identity on the illusion of limitless wealth. To the outside world, he was a highly successful real estate developer. He drove a leased luxury sports car, wore suits tailored in Italy, and posted photos of his expensive dinners on social media. But behind the glossy facade, his business was a fragile house of cards held together by high-interest loans and desperate lies. He was a man drowning in an ocean of debt, trying to convince everyone he was just going for a casual swim. The foundation of his business began to crack precisely at 2 o'clock that afternoon. His primary lenders, a group of ruthless private investors who did not accept excuses, decided they had waited long enough. Justin had borrowed heavily to fund a massive commercial office building downtown, promising quick returns and guaranteed tenants. But the construction was delayed, the tenants pulled out, and the interest payments were compounding at a suffocating rate. He was hopelessly over-leveraged, and his luck had officially run out. I can only imagine him sitting in his high-floor corner office, sweating through his expensive silk shirt as his phone rang incessantly. Every call was another creditor demanding money he simply did not have. The banks were threatening to freeze his lines of credit. His contractors were threatening to walk off the job sites. The financial walls were closing in on him with terrifying speed. The investors gave him a final ultimatum. He had less than 30 days to produce a massive payment of $2 million, or they would foreclose on the commercial project. Even worse, Justin had foolishly used his own home, the very house I had helped pay for, as collateral. Before he even left his office that afternoon, Justin desperately tried to find a lifeline. He made dozens of frantic phone calls to his wealthy friends, his business partners, and anyone he had ever bought an expensive dinner for. He pitched them new projects, begged for short-term loans, and offered outrageous interest rates. But wealthy people possess a highly tuned instinct for desperation. They could smell the panic radiating through the phone. One by one, his supposed friends made polite excuses and hung up. The men he thought respected him were actually just tolerating him while he was paying the bill. In a matter of hours, Justin realized he was entirely alone. When he finally drove his leased luxury car home, the drive must have felt like a funeral march. The confident, condescending man who had mocked my suit at the steakhouse was gone. In his place was a desperate, cornered animal. He walked through the heavy front doors of his house and immediately poured himself a large glass of whiskey. His hands were shaking so violently that the crystal glass clinked loudly against the bottle. Stephanie walked into the room, completely oblivious to the financial storm gathering over her head. She was holding a shopping bag from an incredibly expensive boutique, eager to show off a designer handbag she had purchased just hours earlier. She expected Justin to praise her taste, just like he always did when they were pretending to be royalty. Instead, Justin snapped. His voice echoed through their vast, hollow living room, harsh and full of genuine terror. He yelled at her to return the bag. He yelled that she needed to stop spending money immediately because the credit cards were about to be frozen. Stephanie froze, completely unable to process what she was hearing. The argument that erupted between them shattered the quiet illusion of their perfect marriage. For the first time, Justin was forced to confess the ugly reality of their financial situation. His ego would not allow him to admit total failure, so he softened the blow with lies. He claimed it was just a temporary cash flow problem, a minor dispute with difficult lenders. But Stephanie was not entirely stupid when it came to money. She heard the tremor in his voice. She saw the sweat on his forehead. She knew that men like Justin did not panic over minor cash flow problems. A cold, paralyzing fear gripped my daughter. Her entire world was built on social standing. Her friends at the country club, the women she desperately tried to impress, would devour her if they smelled bankruptcy. She imagined her luxury car being repossessed in the middle of the night. She imagined the foreclosure signs on their front lawn. The thought of losing her status was a fate worse than death. She began to cry, but her tears were not for her husband's immense stress. Her tears were purely for her own impending social humiliation. That night, a deafening ticking clock started in their home. The desperate need for a massive amount of money poisoned the air they breathed. They were standing on the edge of a devastating financial cliff, staring down into the dark abyss of ruin. They needed a miracle or they needed a victim, and as they frantically scrambled to find a lifeline, their desperate, calculating eyes would soon turn toward the only two men they believed they could manipulate. Justin would first look to his wealthy, cold-hearted father. And when that inevitably failed, they would set their sights on the quiet, invisible old man they thought they had already broken. I would learn the exact details of that Thursday morning, much later when my lawyer's private investigator handed me a thick folder outlining the complete collapse of my son-in-law's imaginary empire. When a man is drowning and the water is rising above his neck, he reaches for the largest, most solid object he can find. For Justin, that object was his father. He woke up early putting on his most expensive tailored suit, trying to armor himself in the illusion of success. He drove his leased luxury sports car out to the affluent northern suburbs, where the sprawling estates sat far back from the road, hidden behind massive iron gates and manicured hedges. Lawrence lived in a stone fortress that perfectly reflected the man who owned it. It was cold, imposing, and entirely devoid of warmth. Justin walked through the heavy front doors with his heart hammering against his ribs. He found his father sitting in his cavernous mahogany study reading financial reports with a cup of black coffee. Justin tried to maintain his composure. He attempted to play the role of the confident developer facing a minor hurdle. He presented the $2 million shortfall not as a devastating failure, but as a temporary liquidity issue. He called it a bridge loan. He called it a unique investment opportunity for family. He used all the same corporate buzzwords he had thrown around so arrogantly at the steakhouse just a few nights before. Lawrence did not even look up from his papers at first. When he finally did, his eyes held absolutely no paternal affection. Lawrence had built his massive fortune through ruthless calculation, and he applied that exact same metric to his own blood. He poured himself a glass of expensive scotch and deliberately did not offer one to his son. He looked at Justin and systematically dismantled his entire business plan. Lawrence listed every mistake Justin had made over the past 3 years. He mocked the overvalued commercial property, the exorbitant personal spending, and the pathetic illusion of success built entirely on a foundation of sand. He told his son that he possessed the ambition of a tycoon, but the financial discipline of a foolish child. The polished facade of the successful developer melted away completely. Justin dropped the act and begged. The golden boy reduced himself to a pleading child in front of the man who had bought a $20,000 vacation without blinking an eye. Justin explained that his creditors were threatening to take his house. He talked about the impending public foreclosure. He talked about the sheer social humiliation that was about to rain down on him and Stephanie. He invoked family loyalty, begging for a lifeline to save him from total public ruin. He promised to pay back every single cent with interest if Lawrence would just write the check. Lawrence took a slow sip of his drink and delivered the final blow. He told Justin that writing a check would be a terrible investment. He said that failure was the only teacher arrogance ever listened to. He looked at his trembling son and told him to be a man. He told Justin to face the consequences of his gross incompetence and to stop begging like a coward. Lawrence stated that subsidizing failure only creates more failure. He finished the conversation by telling Justin that bankruptcy would build character and instructed him to leave the study immediately. Justin walked out of that mansion completely broken. The drive back to his own house was a suffocating journey into an inescapable reality. He walked through his front door, where Stephanie was pacing the hardwood floors. She looked at his pale face, his defeated posture, and the last fragile thread of her hope snapped. Justin did not have to say a single word. She knew instantly that Lawrence had refused them. The almighty patriarch had closed his vault and left them to the wolves. The sheer panic of their situation consumed the house like a toxic gas. Stephanie realized her entire identity was about to be repossessed. Her exclusive country club memberships, her designer clothes, her carefully curated social media life, all of it was going to vanish in a matter of weeks. They were going to be exposed to their wealthy friends as complete frauds. The desperation turned the air in their home bitter and violent. They yelled at each other, assigning blame, screaming about unpaid bills, and counting the very few days they had left until the bank seized their assets and locked them out of their home. But humans are dangerous creatures when they are backed into a dark corner. When the initial shock and panic subside, they mutate into a predatory survival instinct. Justin and Stephanie could not extract money from the apex predator of their family, so their frantic minds began to search the absolute bottom of the food chain. They needed someone vulnerable. They needed someone who loved them unconditionally. They needed someone they had successfully manipulated for years without facing any resistance. As they sat in the ruins of their fake wealth, their desperate, calculating thoughts drifted away from the sprawling mansions and the downtown high-rises. They turned their attention toward a modest, rent-controlled apartment in the suburbs. They thought about the quiet old mechanic they had openly humiliated at a steakhouse just a few nights prior. They began to calculate exactly how much my small pension, my savings, and my life insurance policy might be worth. They began to wonder how easily they could liquidate my small life to save their grand illusion. They did not know they were walking directly into a steel trap, but their relentless greed had officially pointed them straight toward my front door. The private investigator my lawyer hired was a master of his craft, piecing together the exact timeline of my daughter's collapse. According to his deeply detailed report, the absolute panic set in for Stephanie on Thursday afternoon. The massive walls of her suburban luxury home felt like they were rapidly shrinking, closing in on her perfectly curated life. Justin had locked himself in his home office, refusing to speak to her, drinking away his massive failures. Stephanie was left entirely alone in her expansive walk-in closet, consumed by a manic, desperate energy. She was surrounded by towers of designer shoeboxes and racks of silk dresses that she suddenly realized were nothing more than heavy anchors, dragging her down into financial ruin. The bank accounts were frozen. The credit limits were utterly exhausted. My daughter was in pure survival mode. She dropped to her knees on the plush white carpet, pulling out every expensive handbag she owned. She was digging frantically, ripping out the silk linings, searching for any crumpled receipt she could find. If she could just return the shoes, the bags, the jewelry she bought over the last month, maybe she could scrape together enough cash to keep up appearances for a few more weeks. She dumped the contents of her favorite leather purse onto the floor. Out tumbled expensive lipsticks, a silver compact, and a flurry of crumpled papers. She sifted through the mess, her perfectly manicured nails catching on the various receipts. There was one from a high-end boutique and another from a luxury day spa. And then there was a small, unremarkable piece of thermal paper. It was not from a designer store. It was stained with a tiny drop of coffee and printed with faded black ink. She picked it up, ready to toss it into the trash can. It was a receipt from the Oak Street gas station dated the Saturday before Father's Day. It listed 12 gallons of premium fuel and a single $5 transaction for a Mega Millions quick pick ticket. Stephanie stared at the receipt for a long second. The memory of that weekend flashed vividly in her mind. She remembered stopping for gas on the way to the country club. She remembered rolling her eyes when she realized she had not bought a gift for her own father. She had marched into that dingy convenience store, breathing through her mouth, to avoid the smell of stale coffee. and purchased the absolute cheapest thing she could find to shove into a greeting card. She had thought it was a hilarious, clever joke. As she held that small piece of paper, the large flat-screen television mounted in her bedroom was playing the local afternoon news. It was just background noise, a steady drone to distract her from the sound of her own racing heart. But then the bright red breaking news graphic flashed across the screen, and the news anchor's voice shifted into that upbeat, excited tone reserved for human interest stories. The anchor announced that the State Lottery Commission was still desperately searching for the lucky winner of the historic $190 million Mega Millions jackpot. Stephanie did not care about the lottery. She was a woman who believed wealth was built on commercial real estate and social leverage, not lucky numbers picked out of a machine. She was about to turn the television off when the reporter on the screen stood in front of a very familiar brick building. The camera panned up to show the glowing green sign of the Oak Street gas station. The reporter smiled brightly into the microphone, stating that officials had just confirmed the winning Quick Pick ticket was sold at this exact location on the Saturday afternoon, right before Father's Day. The expensive designer bags scattered around her suddenly ceased to exist. The impending bankruptcy, the angry creditors, the frozen bank accounts, all of it vanished into a deafening, roaring silence. Stephanie slowly lowered the television volume using the remote. She looked down at the faded thermal receipt trembling in her hand. She looked at the date. She looked at the timestamp. She looked at the $5 lottery charge. The mathematical impossibility of the situation struck her with the force of a freight train. The air was sucked right out of her lungs. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, not with panic this time, but with an explosive, terrifying adrenaline. She had bought the winning ticket. She had held $190 million in her bare hands. It was the ultimate bailout. It was the permanent solution to every single problem crashing down on her fake empire. It was more money than Justin's father had accumulated in his entire miserable life. But then a second wave of realization crashed over her. A cold, suffocating wave that brought her right to the edge of physical sickness. She did not have the ticket. She had taken that golden ticket, that absolute miracle of fortune, and shoved it inside a cheap greeting card. She had slid it across a white tablecloth at a steakhouse. She had looked at the man who sacrificed his entire life for her, smiled maliciously, and given away a vast fortune as an insulting joke. The joke was no longer funny. Stephanie dropped the receipt on the carpet and scrambled to her feet. The tears of self-pity completely dried up instantly, replaced by a predatory, frantic calculation. Her father had the ticket. That quiet, invisible mechanic living in a crumbling suburban apartment was currently sitting on a mountain of absolute wealth. She assumed I was probably totally unaware of what I held in my pocket. She ran out of her closet screaming Justin's name, her mind already spinning a dark web of deceit, desperately trying to figure out exactly how she was going to rip that ticket out of my hands. The knock on my apartment door came late on a Friday evening. I was sitting in my worn recliner watching a rerun of an old Western and sipping my usual cup of cheap decaffeinated coffee. The knocking was loud and frantic, but carrying a strange, forced politeness. I was not expecting any visitors. I shuffled to the door, letting my slippers drag against the hardwood floor, and peered through the peephole. It was Stephanie and Justin. Justin was holding two massive brown paper bags from an artisanal grocery store downtown. Stephanie was vibrating with an unsettling manic energy, shifting her weight from foot to foot. I opened the door slowly, letting the old hinges squeak their familiar complaint. Before the door was even fully open, Stephanie practically lunged at me. She wrapped her arms around my neck in a tight, suffocating hug. The expensive, heavy floral perfume she always wore filled my small, narrow entryway. She had not hugged me like this since she was 10 years old. She called me daddy, a word she had dropped decades ago in favor of a brisk, formal dad. I let my arms hang at my sides for a long moment before giving her a weak, confused pat on the back. Justin pushed past us, his usual arrogant swagger entirely absent. He carried the heavy grocery bags into my tiny kitchen, setting them carefully on the worn laminate counter. He turned around with a wide, manic smile, that completely failed to reach his desperate, bloodshot eyes. He told me they were just in the neighborhood and realized they had not checked on me properly since Father's Day. He called me George, clapping his hands together, his voice practically trembling with false, aggressive cheer. I closed the front door, locking it with a soft click, and turned to observe the performance. I knew exactly what this was. The pivot was so sharp, so violently desperate, that it almost made me pity them. Almost. They were treating me like absolute royalty because they believed I was sitting blindly on their salvation. I decided to give them exactly what they expected to see. I let my shoulders slump a little more. I widened my eyes, putting on a mild, bewildered expression. I asked them why they were here on a Friday night, rubbing my temples slowly, as if my aging mind was struggling to process their sudden arrival. Stephanie immediately started unpacking the groceries. She pulled out thick organic steaks, imported artisanal cheeses, and a heavy bottle of red wine that cost more than my monthly utility bill. She talked a mile a minute, her voice high and breathless. She told me they felt absolutely terrible about the dinner at the steakhouse. She claimed it was all a massive misunderstanding, that Justin was just heavily stressed about a big commercial project, and that Lawrence was just a grumpy old man who did not know how to appreciate real family. She actually forced out a fake, teary-eyed apology, reaching across the kitchen island to hold my hands. I looked down at her perfectly manicured hands, gripping my calloused, grease-stained ones. I could feel the slight, frantic tremor in her fingers. She was terrified. I looked up at her and offered a gentle, vacant smile. I told her it was perfectly fine that I knew how busy they were, and that an old man like me gets confused easily anyway. I used a slightly shaky voice, playing the part of a fragile elder whose memory was beginning to fade into the fog. I told her I hardly even remembered the dinner or what we talked about. Justin jumped on that comment like a starving dog on a bone. He stepped closer, pulling out a kitchen chair for me, treating me like I was made of brittle glass. He asked me how I had been feeling lately, if I had been misplacing things around the apartment, if my memory was slipping more than usual. The predatory angle was so glaringly obvious, I had to bite the inside of my cheek to suppress a smirk. I slowly sat down, letting out a heavy, tired sigh. I told them that yes, my mind plays cruel tricks on me sometimes. I said I forget where I put my keys or I leave the television running all night. Stephanie and Justin exchanged a rapid, electrified glance over my head. They thought they had struck pure gold. They thought I was a doddering old fool who had absolutely no idea he was holding a golden ticket. They thought I was an incredibly easy mark. Stephanie poured me a glass of the expensive wine, her hands shaking so much, she spilled a few dark red drops on the clean counter. She quickly wiped it up, laughing nervously. She asked me what I had been doing the last few days, probing to see if I had left the apartment, if I had gone to a bank, if I had bothered to check any lottery numbers. I took a slow sip of the wine. It was rich and complex, a stark contrast to the bitter reality of my daughter's deceit. I set the glass down and looked at them with mild, cloudy eyes. I told them I had just been resting, staying inside my quiet home watching old television shows. I mentioned that I had not even walked down to the lobby to check my mail. I watched the absolute relief wash over their pale faces. The tight, agonizing tension in Justin's jaw finally released. Stephanie's rigid shoulders dropped. They believed the $190 million was still sitting unclaimed, untouched, right here in this very apartment. The trap was beautifully set. I was sitting at my own kitchen table watching my daughter and her husband desperately try to act like a warm, loving family. They were sweating, suffocating under the crushing weight of their impending bankruptcy, performing a grotesque dance of fake affection just to get their greedy hands on my supposed ignorance. I leaned back in my wooden chair, offering them another warm, clueless smile. The quiet, grieving mechanic was truly dead, and the strategist sitting in his place was thoroughly enjoying the show. The smell of the expensive organic steak sizzling in my old cast-iron skillet filled the small apartment. Justin insisted on cooking it himself, rolling up the sleeves of his tailored shirt and pretending he was perfectly at home in a kitchen that was barely large enough for one person. Stephanie sat across from me at the worn wooden table, pouring another glass of the rich red wine for herself. She was drinking it far too quickly. I could see the slight tremor in her hand every time she lifted the crystal glass to her lips. I took a slow bite of the steak they had served me, chewing deliberately, savoring the absolute absurdity of the situation. Just days ago, I was not even worth a decent greeting card. Tonight, I was being treated like a king by two people who were entirely bankrupt in every sense of the word. We ate in relative silence for a few minutes, the only sounds being the scraping of silverware and the heavy ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. The tension radiating off them was so thick, it felt like physical heat. They were vibrating with an anxious, predatory energy, desperately trying to find the right moment to spring their trap. I kept my eyes focused on my plate, playing the part of the tired, oblivious old man, just happy to have his family visiting on a Friday night. I knew they were silently communicating over my head, exchanging those frantic, wide-eyed looks couples use when they are standing on the edge of a cliff. Their entire world was collapsing, and they were sitting in my rent-controlled apartment, pretending everything was perfect. Stephanie finally cleared her throat, placing her wine glass down on the table with a soft clink. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the scratched wood plastering, on a smile that looked like it physically hurt her face. She told me the steak was delicious, but her voice was tight and strained. I nodded, offering a weak, grateful smile, and told her it was the best meal I had eaten in months. I made sure to let my voice waver just a little, adding to the illusion of my fragile state. She reached across the table again, lightly touching my forearm, and began the delicate, treacherous pivot. She brought up Father's Day. She told me she had been feeling absolutely terrible all week about the gifts. She claimed she had been so distracted by Justin's massive real estate projects that she completely dropped the ball on finding me something special. She actually managed to force a look of deep, genuine shame into her eyes. It was a masterful performance. If I did not already know the truth, if I had not spent the last 48 hours securing my new empire with Mr. Sullivan, I might have actually believed her. She told me she felt so guilty about handing me that cheap little card at the steakhouse while Lawrence received a luxury vacation. She said it was thoughtless and cruel and that she had not been able to sleep because of the guilt. I kept my expression entirely blank, a perfect mask of mild confusion and forgiveness. I patted her hand gently and told her she did not need to apologize. I said I understood how busy their lives were and that just seeing them was enough of a gift for an old man like me. Justin chimed in from the counter, wiping down the stove with frantic, aggressive motions. He agreed with Stephanie, forcing a loud, hollow laugh, saying they had totally messed up the celebration and owed me a real vacation. Then Stephanie took a slow, deep breath, preparing to cross the minefield. Her eyes locked onto mine, searching for any sign of comprehension. She kept her tone remarkably light, breezy, almost careless, as if the thought had just randomly crossed her mind. She asked me about the little lottery ticket she had tucked inside that card. She let out a soft, manufactured chuckle, asking if I had thrown it in the trash on the way home, or if I had actually bothered to check the numbers. She mentioned that she had heard on the local news that someone in our area won a bit of money recently, and she just thought it would be a funny coincidence if I had won a few dollars. The air in my tiny kitchen stopped moving entirely. Justin froze by the stove, his back completely rigid, the dish towel hovering motionless over the counter. He was not breathing. Stephanie was staring at me so intensely, her eyes looked completely black. The desperation was pouring out of her, an invisible, suffocating wave of pure panic. They were waiting for the verdict. They were waiting to find out if their salvation was sitting in my pocket, or if it was gone forever. I let the silence drag out. I let it hang over the table for 10 agonizing seconds. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my water, my hand trembling just enough to sell the performance of a tired old man struggling to remember a minor detail. I furrowed my brow, looking up at the ceiling, as if I were searching through the cloudy fog of my fading memory. I watched the blood drain completely out of Stephanie's face. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the table so hard, her knuckles turned pure white. I could see the frantic pulse beating rapidly at the base of her throat. Finally, I looked back down at her. I offered a soft, dismissive sigh, relaxing my shoulders. I told her I honestly could not remember what I did with it. I said I brought the suit home and took the card out, but my memory had been so foggy lately. I dropped the calculated lie with absolute chilling perfection. I told her I think I lost it somewhere in the apartment. I said it was probably shoved in a junk drawer or buried under a pile of old mail on the desk, but I was certain it was still floating around the house somewhere. The sheer terror that erupted behind Stephanie's eyes was the most satisfying thing I had ever witnessed. It was a beautiful, devastating mixture of absolute horror and explosive hope. The ticket was not in the trash. It was not claimed. It was lost. It was sitting somewhere inside these four walls, a $190 million piece of paper buried under old newspapers and dusty mechanic manuals. Justin let out a loud, shuddering exhale, turning around to face us, his face slick with a cold sweat. He tried to laugh a broken, hysterical sound, telling me that I really needed to be more careful with my things. Stephanie swallowed hard, her chest heaving as she desperately tried to push down the overwhelming panic. She managed to stretch her lips into a ghastly, trembling smile. She told me it was no big deal at all, just a silly piece of paper, but that she would hate for me to have a messy apartment. She offered to help me clean up a bit this weekend, suggesting they could organize my drawers and sort through my old mail just to make my life a little easier. I smiled vacantly, thanking her for being such a wonderful, thoughtful daughter. The trap was fully sprung, and they were standing right in the center of it, entirely consumed by their own blinding greed. The heavy meal ended, and I pushed my empty plate away, letting out a long, tired sigh. I rubbed my eyes slowly and told them that the rich food and the late hour had completely drained my limited energy. I said my old bones were aching, and I just needed to lie down for a short afternoon nap. Stephanie practically jumped out of her chair to clear my plate away from the table. She told me to go rest and promised they would stay very quiet and clean up the kitchen for me. Her voice was entirely too bright and far too eager. Justin nodded vigorously and said they would take care of absolutely everything, so I could just relax in peace. I thanked them with a weak, grateful smile and slowly shuffled down the narrow hallway toward my bedroom. I closed the door, but deliberately left it open just a small crack. I took off my shoes and sat on the edge of my mattress, but I did not lie down. I walked softly back to the door and positioned myself perfectly in the dark shadows of the room. I could see the entire living room and kitchen through the narrow vertical opening. For a minute, there was only the sound of running water and the clinking of ceramic dishes. They were keeping up the act of being helpful guests just in case I was still listening from my bed. But the exact moment the water turned off, the real performance began. I watched as Stephanie grabbed a dish towel and wiped her wet hands with frantic, aggressive motions. She looked across the kitchen at Justin and nodded her head. The silent, desperate command was given. They moved through my home like starving scavengers. Justin went straight for the small wooden desk in the corner of the living room. It was the desk where Diane used to balance our checkbook and pay our monthly bills. Justin yanked the top drawer open with zero respect for the delicate old wood. He began grabbing thick handfuls of old envelopes, utility bills, and faded greeting cards. He riffled through them with desperate, blinding speed, tossing the discarded papers carelessly onto the floor. He checked every single envelope, tearing them open with his thumbs, while his eyes remained wide and frantic. Stephanie dropped to her knees right in front of the television stand. She started pulling open the bottom cabinets, where I kept old family photo albums and appliance instruction manuals. She tossed the heavy albums onto the rug, not even glancing at the pictures of her own childhood. She was hunting for a single colored piece of paper. Her perfectly styled hair fell into her face and she shoved it back with a trembling, sweaty hand. I could hear their harsh whispers echoing in the quiet apartment. Stephanie asked Justin if he had checked the trash cans yet. Justin replied that he had already dug through the kitchen bin and found nothing but wet coffee grounds and broken eggshells. It was a pathetic and utterly devastating sight. The highly successful real estate developer and his pristine country club wife were crawling on the floor of a rent-controlled apartment acting like common street thieves. They moved to the couch next. Justin grabbed the heavy plaid cushions and ripped them violently off the wooden frame. He shoved his hands deep into the dusty crevices of the old sofa, searching blindly for my lottery ticket. Stephanie was checking under the large area rug, lifting the frayed corners and feeling the bare floorboards beneath it. They were visibly sweating now. The crushing stress and the overwhelming panic were radiating physically from their bodies. I stood motionless in the dark hallway, watching the daughter I had sacrificed everything for tear my safe home apart. I watched her throw my precious memories onto the floor without a second thought. She grabbed a small decorative tin box from the coffee table. It was the special box where I kept Diane's old sewing supplies. Stephanie dumped the contents directly onto the glass table, sending spools of colorful thread and sharp needles scattering everywhere. She did not care about the mess she was making. She did not care about my home or my feelings. She only cared about finding her immediate financial salvation. Their whispers grew louder and much more aggressive as the minutes ticked by and they found absolutely nothing. Justin told Stephanie to check the pockets of the coats hanging by the front door. He said I probably just left it in a jacket pocket after the dinner. Stephanie ran over to the coat rack and began violently patting down my old winter coats. She checked the deep pockets, pulling out used tissues and loose coins, dropping them carelessly on the entryway floor. Justin was now back in the kitchen, opening overhead cabinets and checking inside empty coffee cans and cardboard cereal boxes. The absolute desperation was making them irrational. They were looking in places that made absolutely no logical sense for a man to leave a ticket. I felt a cold, absolute certainty settle deep in my chest. If I had ever harbored a tiny lingering doubt about their true nature, it evaporated completely right then. They were not looking for the ticket to give it back to me. They were not searching my home to help a confused old man claim his rightful prize. They were hunting for that piece of paper so they could steal it and claim it as their own. They fully intended to walk out of my apartment with my winning ticket and leave me with absolutely nothing. They would have let me believe I truly lost it, and they would have lived like wealthy royalty while I counted my pennies for groceries. Justin stood up from the kitchen floor, his face flushed red and slick with nervous sweat. He dragged his trembling hands down his face and looked at Stephanie with wild, panicked eyes. He whispered harshly that the ticket was not there. He said I must have thrown it away somewhere outside or dropped it on the dark street. Stephanie shook her head furiously in denial. She told him to keep looking everywhere. She said I was an old hoarder who never threw anything away, and that the ticket had to be buried in this disgusting apartment somewhere. Hearing her call my home disgusting did not even hurt my feelings. It just validated every single decision I had made since that Tuesday night. They spent another 20 minutes tearing through the few remaining spaces in the front rooms. They checked behind the old books on the small wooden shelf. They lifted the corners of the framed pictures hanging on the wall. They even looked under the microwave and the toaster oven on the kitchen counter. Their physical movements became much slower and far more defeated as the crushing reality of their failure finally set in. The apartment was a complete disaster zone. Papers were scattered across the floor, cushions were piled in the corner, and cabinet doors were left swinging wide open. Eventually, Justin collapsed onto the bare wooden frame of the couch, burying his head deep in his hands. He looked completely broken and out of options. Stephanie stood alone in the center of the living room, breathing heavily and staring blankly at the massive mess they had created. She looked around the room with absolute despair, realizing that their golden ticket was nowhere to be found. She whispered to Justin that they needed to clean up before I woke from my nap. They began to hastily shove the scattered papers back into the drawers and toss the heavy cushions back onto the couch. They did not organize anything properly. They just hid the obvious evidence of their frantic invasion. I backed away quietly from the crack in the door and sat silently on the edge of my bed. I listened to them frantically trying to restore my living room to its original state. The physical show was over for now. They had failed to find the physical ticket, but their toxic desperation was far from extinguished. I knew that cornered animals do not just give up and accept defeat peacefully. they find another way to attack their prey. They would realize that if the ticket was truly lost, they had no immediate access to fast cash. And if they could not find the ticket, they would soon turn their predatory eyes toward the only other assets I possessed. I laid back on my soft pillows, closing my eyes, and prepared myself for the next phase of their pathetic, predictable war. The heavy thud of the living room sofa being shoved back into place echoed through the thin walls of my apartment. I remained perfectly still on the edge of my bed, listening intently to the muffled sounds of my daughter and her husband trying to erase the evidence of their frantic invasion. Their footsteps moved away from the living area, dragging heavily toward the small kitchen. The rushing water from the faucet masked their voices for a brief moment. But as soon as the plumbing groaned to a halt, the harsh, panicked whispers began again. They thought I was deeply asleep, totally oblivious to the predatory conversation happening just a few feet away from my bedroom door. I carefully leaned closer to the narrow crack in the doorframe, holding my breath. Justin spoke first, his voice low and trembling with absolute frustration. He told Stephanie that the ticket was definitely not in the apartment. He said they had checked every conceivable hiding spot, every drawer, and every single piece of loose paper. The desperation in his tone was thick and suffocating. He muttered that an old man with a bad memory could not have hidden a lottery ticket so perfectly. Then the horrifying realization dawned on him. He whispered to my daughter that I must have already claimed it or locked it away in a secure safety deposit box downtown. Stephanie let out a sharp, trembling breath that sounded almost like a sob. She asked him what they were going to do now. She reminded him that his creditors were threatening to take their house in a matter of weeks, and that the social humiliation of bankruptcy would completely destroy their lives. Her panic was escalating rapidly, completely consuming any shred of rational thought. She whined that if I had the money hidden away in a trust or a bank account, they would never be able to access it before the real estate business collapsed. She said I was too stubborn to just hand over millions of dollars to pay for his massive commercial debts. Justin paced the tight confines of my kitchen, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the linoleum. The silence stretched out thick and poisonous. Then Justin stopped pacing. He stepped very close to Stephanie, and his voice dropped to a cold, calculating register that made the hair on my arms stand up. He told her that if I had the money, they simply needed to take control of my entire life. He said that if an old man cannot manage his own fortune, his family has a legal obligation to step in and manage it for him. He used the words legal obligation, but the underlying threat was clear and absolute. Stephanie asked him exactly how they could possibly force me to surrender control of my finances. Justin laid out his sinister strategy with the practiced ease of a man completely devoid of a moral compass. He told her they needed to obtain full power of attorney. He said that once they had my legal signature handing over my rights, they could access my bank accounts, liquidate my assets, and funnel the entire fortune directly into his failing company. Stephanie sounded hesitant for a brief second, asking how they could ever convince me to sign away my rights when I was perfectly capable of living on my own. Justin let out a dark, humorless chuckle. He told his wife that they would not be asking for my permission. He explained that if a doctor officially diagnosed me with early-stage dementia or severe cognitive decline, the courts would immediately grant them emergency control over my life. Stephanie protested weakly, saying that my primary care physician had just seen me a few months ago and knew my mind was as sharp as it had ever been. Justin brushed her concern aside immediately. He told her they would not be using my regular doctor. He whispered that he knew a private physician from his real estate dealings, a shady, unethical doctor who specialized in concierge medicine for wealthy clients facing delicate family situations. Justin explained that this doctor was currently drowning in gambling debts and would gladly sign any medical evaluation they needed for a generous cut of the lottery money. The plan was chillingly simple. They would bring this corrupt physician to the apartment, claiming he was a specialist performing a routine checkup. They would drug my coffee or switch my blood pressure medications just enough to make me appear genuinely confused and disoriented during the examination. The doctor would write a devastating report, declaring me completely incompetent. I stood in the dark hallway, listening to my own flesh and blood plot the total destruction of my freedom. Stephanie did not scream. She did not defend me. She did not tell her husband that he had crossed a line into absolute evil. Instead, she asked what they would do with me once they seized control of the $190 million. Justin replied that they could not leave me in the apartment because I might wander off and cause a legal problem. He told her they would have to commit me to a specialized care facility. He specifically mentioned finding a substandard low-cost nursing home far away from the city so I could not contact anyone who might investigate their claims. He said they would lock me away in a tiny room, strip me of my dignity, and let me fade into absolute obscurity while they used my jackpot to rebuild their fake empire. The sheer depravity of their conversation was breathtaking. My daughter, the girl I had raised with every ounce of love in my body, readily agreed to the plan. She whispered that it was for the best that I was old anyway, and that this money belonged to their family legacy. She rationalized her treason by convincing herself that a nursing home was the safest place for me. They justified my imprisonment as a necessary casualty of their financial survival. I backed away from the crack in the door, moving silently across the dark bedroom. I sat on the edge of my mattress, staring at the empty wall. They were not just greedy children making a selfish mistake. They were active predators preparing to steal my mind, my fortune, and my freedom. They intended to bury me alive in a cheap facility just to maintain their country club memberships and their leased sports cars. I felt no sorrow anymore. The lingering grief over losing my daughter evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I closed my eyes and smiled in the dark. They thought they were setting an inescapable trap for a fragile old man. They had absolutely no idea that I was already 10 steps ahead of them, preparing a checkmate that would leave them with nothing but the ashes of their arrogance. I waited in the dark shadows of my bedroom until I heard the heavy wooden door of my apartment click shut. The dead silence of the evening returned instantly. My daughter and her husband had finally abandoned their pathetic performance and left my home. I walked out into the living room. The space was a disaster. Couch cushions were slightly askew and the drawers of my desk were improperly closed. I walked over to the entryway where Stephanie had aggressively patted down my winter coats. I bent down to pick up a few loose coins she had knocked onto the floor. As my hand brushed against the baseboard, my fingers grazed against a thick piece of glossy paper. It had fallen out of her designer coat pocket during her frantic search. I picked it up and held it under the dim yellow light of the hallway fixture. It was a trifold brochure. The cover featured a stock photo of a smiling nurse pushing a blank-faced elderly man in a wheelchair. The bold letters at the top read, "Whispering Pines Behavioral Care and Memory Center." I opened the heavy paper and read the chilling descriptions printed inside. It advertised secure locked wards, 24-hour monitored confinement, and specialized care for patients with severe non-compliant cognitive decline. It boasted about their streamlined admission processes for families holding emergency power of attorney. This was not a luxury retirement community. This was a sophisticated prison for old men whose families wanted them to disappear quietly. My daughter had carried this brochure into my home. She had it in her pocket while she hugged me and poured me expensive wine. She had already been touring these facilities, picking out the exact place where she would lock me away to rot. A deep, profound disgust washed over me. I did not feel a single ounce of paternal forgiveness. I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my cell phone. I unlocked the screen and dialed the private number Mr. Sullivan had given me just a few days prior. He had told me he was available at any hour for emergencies regarding the trust. The phone rang only twice before the sharp, professional voice of my new lawyer answered. I did not bother with pleasantries. I told Mr. Sullivan exactly what had transpired in my apartment over the past 3 hours. I detailed the frantic search, the desperate acting, and the horrifying conversation I had recorded from the shadows of my hallway. I read him the name of the facility from the glossy brochure. I explained their plan to hire a corrupt concierge doctor to drug me and forge a medical diagnosis of dementia so they could seize my entire estate. Mr. Sullivan did not gasp or express shock. He processed the information with the icy calculation of a man who dealt with the darkest corners of human greed for a living. He told me that my family was making a massive tactical error by moving so aggressively. He stated that their desperation was making them sloppy, and that we were going to use that sloppiness to utterly destroy their legal standing. He instructed me to keep the brochure in my secure lockbox alongside the lottery ticket. It was no longer just a piece of trash. It was physical evidence of premeditated elder abuse and conspiracy. Then Mr. Sullivan told me it was time to go on the offensive. He said we could no longer simply wait for them to bring this corrupt doctor to my door. We needed to know every single move they were making before they made it. He told me he was immediately dispatching a private investigator from a highly specialized firm he kept on retainer. This investigator was not a man who simply took photographs from a parked car. He was a ruthless professional who extracted bank records, tracked digital footprints, and documented criminal conspiracies for high-net-worth clients. Mr. Sullivan assured me that by tomorrow morning, this investigator would be trailing Justin and Stephanie. He would identify the shady doctor they planned to hire. He would map out the exact depth of Justin's impending bankruptcy. He would document every panicked phone call and every desperate meeting they held. He promised me that we would build a fortress of undeniable evidence so thick that no judge in the country would ever grant my daughter power of attorney. I thanked my lawyer and ended the call. The apartment felt different now. It was no longer the site of my humiliation. It had become my command center. I walked back into my bedroom and opened the metal lockbox at the bottom of my closet. I placed the glossy brochure right next to the plastic bag holding my winning ticket. They were two pieces of paper that represented the absolute extremes of my new reality. One was the key to my unlimited freedom, and the other was the map to the prison my own daughter had designed for me. I locked the box and placed it back under the heavy winter sweaters. I felt a strange, exhilarating sense of calm settle over my tired bones. My physical body was old and aching, but my mind was sharper than it had been in decades. I knew the coming days would require a masterful performance. I would have to look my daughter in the eyes and smile while knowing she was actively plotting my demise. I would have to play the part of the fragile, fading old man perfectly, so they would continue to walk blindly into the trap Mr. Sullivan and I were building. The game had fundamentally changed. I was no longer the victim waiting for the axe to fall. I was the architect of their ruin. Every fake smile Stephanie gave me from now on would just be another nail in her own coffin. Every condescending word Justin spoke would simply add to the mountain of evidence against him. I turned off the bedside lamp and lay down in the dark. For the first time since Father's Day, I fell into a deep, dreamless, and incredibly peaceful sleep, knowing that justice was already in motion. The heavy oak door of Richard Sullivan's office closed with a solid, reassuring thud. It was Monday morning, and the city outside was a chaotic blur of rushing executives and blaring sirens. Inside this room, however, the air was still and perfectly controlled. I sat in the same leather chair across from the massive mahogany desk. Mr. Sullivan sat opposite me, sliding a thick manila folder across the polished wood. It was the preliminary dossier from the private investigator he had dispatched over the weekend. I opened the cover and stared at the documented collapse of my daughter's life. The investigator had been ruthlessly efficient. The pages were filled with photographs, bank routing numbers, and transcripts of desperate phone calls. Justin's real estate company was not just failing. It was a smoking crater. He had defaulted on 3 major commercial loans, and his primary investors were preparing to file civil lawsuits for gross mismanagement of funds. Stephanie had spent the entire weekend bouncing between high-end retail stores attempting to return luxury handbags and designer shoes for cash. When the stores refused because the items were clearly used, she had thrown public screaming tantrums. Mr. Sullivan steepled his fingers and watched me process the information. He noted that their financial desperation was severe, but he pointed out something else. He said that criminals usually steal to survive, but my daughter and her husband were plotting a complex medical kidnapping simply to maintain a country club membership. He leaned forward and asked me a very direct question. He wanted to know how a hard-working mechanic raised a daughter who possessed such a staggering disconnect from the value of a dollar and such a lethal sense of entitlement. I closed the folder and looked down at my hands. The knuckles were permanently swollen, and deep scars crossed the faded skin. I told my lawyer that the entitlement was my fault. I was the one who built the illusion she lived in. I took a slow breath and let the heavy, bitter truth spill out into the quiet room. I told him about a secret I had kept buried for 15 years. A secret not even my late wife Diane knew the full extent of. 15 years ago, Stephanie received an acceptance letter to one of the most prestigious and expensive private universities in the country. She was a smart girl, but her grades were not quite high enough to secure the massive academic grants she needed. We filled out the financial aid forms and the reality hit us like a brick wall. The tuition was astronomical. Stephanie wept in her bedroom for 3 days, convinced her life was over, because she would be forced to attend a local state college like a commoner. She told me her entire future depended on rubbing shoulders with the elite at that specific university. I could not bear to hear my daughter cry. So I made the most destructive decision of my life. I told Stephanie that a miraculous anonymous alumni scholarship had suddenly come through, covering her entire tuition and her room and board. She was ecstatic. She bragged to all her wealthy friends that she had earned a full academic ride based purely on her brilliant mind. She packed her bags and left for her elite campus believing she was entirely self-sufficient. The truth was there was no anonymous alumni donor. There was only a 56-year-old mechanic who quietly took a second job. Every single night, after finishing a brutal 10-hour shift at the auto garage, I would drive to a massive logistics warehouse on the industrial edge of the city. From 10 at night until 4 in the morning, I worked the loading docks. I moved heavy pallets of commercial goods in freezing, unheated trailers. I lifted, crushed, and carried freight until my vision blurred and my muscles screamed in absolute agony. While I would drive home as the sun was coming up, sleep for 3 miserable hours, and then wake up to go back to the garage. I did that for 4 agonizing years. I destroyed my back. I ruined my knees. My hands bled inside my work gloves during the winter months. But every time the semester tuition bill arrived, I paid it in full and in cash. I funneled my blood and my broken bones directly into the university bursar office so my daughter could walk around her beautiful manicured campus without a single ounce of student debt weighing her down. I looked up at Mr. Sullivan. He was staring at me with a profound, unreadable expression. I told him that my sacrifice did not teach her the value of hard work. It completely erased it. Because she thought the money came from a magical scholarship, she grew arrogant. She spent her college years networking with the children of millionaires. She learned to look down on the working class. She learned to mock the very people who clean the floors and load the trucks. She used that elitist degree to secure a job at a luxury firm where she eventually met Justin. I funded her transition into the exact social class that now views me as disposable garbage. I bought her the ticket to a world where a father is only as valuable as his investment portfolio. I told my lawyer that I spent 4 years freezing on a concrete loading dock just so she could eventually sit in a fancy steakhouse and hand me a $5 lottery ticket as a joke. I built the monster that was currently trying to lock me in a psychiatric ward. Mr. Sullivan remained completely silent for a long moment. He did not offer empty pity or hollow comfort. Instead, he reached across the desk and tapped the manila folder containing the evidence of their impending ruin. He told me that my daughter had spent 15 years living on a mountain built by my invisible labor. He said it was finally time to pull the mountain out from underneath her. I nodded slowly. The lingering guilt I felt over hiding the lottery winnings dissolved entirely. The debt had been paid in full a long time ago. Now I was just collecting the interest. Mr. Sullivan opened the second file on his heavy mahogany desk. It contained a comprehensive breakdown of Justin's commercial and personal debts. The numbers were staggering. Justin was not just a failing developer. He was a man who had built his entire adult life on a mountain of high-interest leverage. The investigator had found evidence of multiple defaulted loans, maxed-out credit cards, and a particularly alarming debt to a group of private unlisted lenders who operated far outside the bounds of traditional banking. Mr. Sullivan looked up from the dossier, his sharp eyes analyzing my reaction. He pointed out that Justin was desperate, the kind of desperate that makes men unpredictable and highly dangerous. He noted that Justin and Stephanie had been maintaining a lifestyle that required hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in cash flow to sustain. The luxury cars, the country club memberships, the designer wardrobes, all of it was financed by a collapsing house of cards. My lawyer leaned back in his leather chair and asked me a pointed question. He wanted to know how they had managed to sustain this illusion for so long. He asked if Justin's father, Lawrence, had been subsidizing their lifestyle. The mere mention of Lawrence's name brought a bitter metallic taste to the back of my throat. I shook my head and told Mr. Sullivan the second secret I had buried deep down. I told him that Lawrence had never given them a single red cent. Lawrence was a man who believed that opening his wallet was a sign of profound weakness. He viewed his wealth as a weapon to control people, not a tool to support his family. I took a slow breath and recounted the events leading up to Stephanie and Justin's wedding 6 years ago. Stephanie had come to me practically hyperventilating with anxiety. She explained that Justin's family expected a grand, lavish affair. They expected a historic downtown venue, imported flowers, a 10-piece live band, and a guest list packed with Chicago's corporate elite. She told me that Lawrence had firmly stated he would not contribute to the wedding, citing some antiquated tradition about the bride's family covering the costs. Stephanie was terrified. She was terrified that Justin's family would realize she was just the daughter of a suburban mechanic. She was terrified they would look down on her if the wedding did not meet their suffocatingly high standards. She sat at my small kitchen table and cried, telling me her entire future in Justin's social circle depended on throwing a flawless high society wedding. I could not stand to see the panic in her eyes, so I did what I had always done. I absorbed the burden to protect her from the reality of her choices. I went to my local bank the following morning. I sat down with a loan officer I had known for 20 years. I took the small, modest house that Diane and I had worked so hard to pay off, and I signed the papers to take out a massive second mortgage. I mortgaged the roof over my own head, the only true asset I possessed, to fund a single night of exorbitant vanity. I handed Stephanie a cashier's check that drained the equity right out of my life's work. I told her I had been saving for years, specifically for this occasion. She hugged me tightly, thanking me profusely, and then immediately turned around and spent every single dollar orchestrating an event designed solely to impress people who fundamentally despised us. On the day of the wedding, I wore the same outdated navy blue suit I would later wear to the Father's Day dinner. I sat quietly at the back of the reception hall, watching Lawrence hold court with his wealthy friends. I listened as guests complimented the sheer elegance of the event, assuming Justin's successful real estate firm or Lawrence's deep pockets had footed the massive bill. Stephanie never corrected them. She allowed Lawrence to accept the quiet praise of his peers. She actively participated in the illusion that she was marrying into money, rather than acknowledging that her working-class father had literally bet his house to buy her a seat at their table. Mr. Sullivan listened to the story without interrupting. His expression remained incredibly still, masking whatever professional judgment he was forming about my past decisions. When I finished, he closed the file on Justin's debts. He told me that my daughter and her husband were not just financially bankrupt. They were morally bankrupt. He said they had spent their entire relationship standing on my shoulders while actively trying to push my head underwater. He leaned across the desk and outlined the reality of our current situation. By investigating their finances, we had confirmed that they had absolutely no other options. Lawrence had cut them off. The banks had frozen their accounts. The private lenders were circling. I was the only viable target left on their radar. They needed to execute their plan to have me declared incompetent quickly, because they were entirely out of time. Mr. Sullivan told me that this desperation was exactly what we were going to exploit. He said we needed to give them enough rope to hang themselves legally. We needed to let them initiate the process, let them present their fraudulent claims, and then crush them with the absolute weight of our accumulated evidence. I agreed. I felt no hesitation. The father who had remortgaged his house to buy his daughter's fake happiness was long gone. He had been replaced by a man fully prepared to watch her fake empire burn to the ground. The visits became a regular occurrence over the next 2 weeks. Stephanie and Justin started dropping by my apartment almost every other day. They always arrived with an air of frantic, forced cheerfulness, carrying cheap, pre-cooked meals or useless trinkets they bought to maintain the illusion of being devoted children. I knew exactly why they were there. They were evaluating their prey. They were watching me closely, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. So I decided to give them exactly what they were looking for. I began the greatest acting performance of my entire life. I leaned heavily into their trap. I started leaving the television blaring at odd hours and pretending I did not know how to turn it down. When they walked through the front door, I would stare at them for a few seconds too long, blinking in manufactured confusion, before finally greeting them. I deliberately misplaced my apartment keys, hiding them inside the refrigerator or under the sofa cushions, and then feigned absolute panic while they helped me search the rooms. I even called Justin by the name of an old mechanic I used to work with, apologizing profusely while rubbing my temples as if my brain was swimming in a thick, heavy fog. It was a degrading, humiliating role to play, but the reward was watching their reactions. Whenever I stumbled over a sentence or forgot a simple detail, they would exchange rapid, electrified glances. I could see the greedy, triumphant sparks lighting up behind my daughter's eyes. She thought my mind was finally rotting away. She thought the strong, capable father who had carried her through life was decaying into a helpless, pathetic old fool. She did not feel sorrow or pity for my supposed decline. She only felt relief. Her problem was solving itself perfectly. As my fake symptoms worsened, Stephanie's confidence skyrocketed. She stopped bothering to hide her condescension. She began speaking to me in a high-pitched, patronizing voice like I was a stubborn toddler who could not be trusted to tie his own shoes. She walked around my apartment reorganizing my mail, throwing away my personal letters and rearranging my cabinets without asking for permission. She was already claiming her territory. She was physically marking my home as her own domain, firmly establishing her absolute control over my life. I sat in my worn recliner observing her swift, hostile takeover of my personal space. It was a profound tragedy to watch your own flesh and blood strip away your dignity with such effortless cruelty. There was a time when I would have done anything to protect her from the harsh realities of the world. Now I was simply collecting the final pieces of evidence required to lock her inside the prison she was so desperately trying to build for me. The climax of their desperate charade happened on a rainy Thursday afternoon. Stephanie arrived alone this time. She walked through my front door carrying a thick manila folder clutched tightly against her chest. Her face was flushed, and her movements were sharp and erratic. The deadline for Justin's commercial loans was rapidly approaching, and they were running completely out of time. She sat me down at the small kitchen table, pouring me a cup of lukewarm tea. She patted my hand and put on her most sickeningly sweet, manufactured smile. She slid the thick stack of papers across the scratched wooden table. She told me that she had been spending the entire morning on the phone with my health insurance company. She claimed they were overcharging me for my prescriptions and that she had found a much better comprehensive plan for seniors. She said the insurance representatives needed me to sign a few routine updated medical forms to authorize the new coverage. She handed me a black pen and tapped her manicured finger on the bottom of the last page, urging me to just sign quickly so she could mail them out before the post office closed. I looked down at the dense legal documents. I did not need to put on my reading glasses to know exactly what was sitting in front of me. I had spent hours with Mr. Sullivan reviewing these exact types of forms. There was no medical insurance company. There was no new prescription plan. The documents resting on my kitchen table were comprehensive, durable power of attorney forms. They were legally binding contracts specifically designed to strip away every single one of my civil and financial rights. If I signed on that dotted line, I would be legally declaring myself incompetent. I would be handing Stephanie total, absolute control over my bank accounts, my medical decisions, my property, and my life. She would have the legal authority to drain my secret trust fund to bail out her husband's failing real estate business. She would have the undeniable right to drag me out of my home against my will and lock me away in that horrible psychiatric facility she had researched. She was asking me to sign my own death warrant with a smile on her face. I held the black pen in my trembling hand, keeping up the facade of the fragile, confused old man. I looked at the complicated legal jargon swimming across the page and let out a long, heavy sigh. I looked up at my daughter, pretending to be overwhelmed by the dense paragraphs. I asked her if she was absolutely sure this was just for my medicine. I watched her lie straight to my face without a single ounce of hesitation. She swore on her life that it was only to help me save a few dollars. She looked into the eyes of the man who had mortgaged his home to pay for her wedding, and she tried to steal my freedom without blinking. I lowered the pen. I knew I had them exactly where I wanted them. I told her that my eyes were just too tired to read the small print today, and that my hand was cramping up from the damp weather. I saw the flash of pure murderous rage cross her face when I set the pen down. She tried to push the paper closer, begging me to just do a quick scribble, but I shook my head stubbornly. I told her I would be happy to sign her medical forms, but I wanted to do it properly. The trap was set perfectly, and all I had to do was invite them to the execution. I looked at my daughter standing in my small kitchen, holding the documents that would legally erase me. The air in the room was thick with her manufactured urgency. The power of attorney papers rested on the scratched wooden table next to my lukewarm tea. She was waiting for the stroke of a pen that would surrender my freedom and secure her fake empire. I did not flinch. I did not argue. I let the silence hang for just a moment longer before I reached out and gently patted her hand. I looked up at her, offering a warm, deeply appreciative smile. I told her how incredibly grateful I was that she was taking such good care of me. I let my voice soften, taking on the tone of an exhausted old man who was finally ready to let someone else carry the burden. I said that managing my affairs had become entirely too confusing lately, and that knowing she was handling the medical insurance gave me such profound peace of mind. The absolute relief that washed over Stephanie's face was instantaneous and profound. The tight lines around her mouth vanished. She let out a long, shuddering breath, believing she had just won the lottery all over again. She eagerly pushed the black pen closer to my hand, tapping the signature line with a manicured fingernail. She told me I just needed to sign right there at the bottom, and she would handle all the complicated mailing and processing. She promised that I would never have to worry about a confusing medical bill ever again. I picked up the pen, rolling it slowly between my fingers. I looked down at the thick legal jargon printed on the page, and then I gently set the pen back down on the table. I told her I would gladly sign every single page she needed me to. I said I trusted her completely and wanted to make sure she had all the authority she needed to manage my care. But I added a small hesitant caveat. I told her that because these forms looked so incredibly official and important, I really did not want to make a mistake and fill them out incorrectly. I said that Diane and I had always been so careful with our legal paperwork, and I just wanted to make sure everything was done perfectly by the book, so she would not face any bureaucratic headaches later. Stephanie tried to mask her sudden panic with a quick, dismissive laugh. She assured me it was just a standard routine form, and that I did not need to worry about making mistakes because she had already highlighted all the necessary boxes. She practically begged me to just do a quick scribble so she could get it into the afternoon mail. I shook my head stubbornly, playing the role of the rigid, old-fashioned patriarch who refused to cut corners on important matters. I told her I had recently met a very nice estate lawyer downtown who was helping me organize my small life insurance policy. I said it would make me feel so much better if we just took these forms to his office tomorrow morning and signed them officially with a notary present. The hesitation in Stephanie's eyes was palpable. She did not want lawyers involved. She did not want anyone looking closely at these documents, but she was also staring directly at the finish line. The prize was right there within her grasp, and she was absolutely desperate not to spook me. She quickly calculated the risk. She assumed my new lawyer was just some cheap storefront attorney dealing with simple wills and minor estates. She believed she was far smarter and much more sophisticated than any lawyer I could afford. She assumed she could easily charm or intimidate a low-level attorney into stamping the papers without a second thought. Her manufactured smile returned brighter and more enthusiastic than before. She agreed immediately, telling me that if going to a lawyer's office made me feel more secure, then that is exactly what we would do. She praised me for being so responsible and thorough. She quickly gathered the power of attorney documents back into her manila folder, clutching it tightly against her chest, as if it were a shield. She asked for the lawyer's address, promising to pick me up first thing in the morning, so we could get it all finalized before lunch. I gave her the address of Mr. Sullivan's office downtown. I watched her quickly type it into her phone, completely unaware that she was programming the coordinates to her own execution. She kissed my cheek, a cold, mechanical gesture, and practically skipped out of my apartment, vibrating with a toxic, triumphant energy. She was absolutely certain she had outsmarted the old man. She thought she was leading me to the slaughterhouse. She had absolutely no idea that I was the one holding the leash, and she was walking eagerly right into the center of the slaughterhouse I had built specifically for her. Friday morning brought a crisp, harsh light to the Chicago skyline. I sat at the head of a massive glass conference table on the 4th floor of Richard Sullivan's building. The room was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation. There were no warm colors, no comforting pictures on the walls. It was a space designed entirely for the ruthless execution of power. I was wearing the exact same outdated navy blue suit I had worn to the steakhouse on Father's Day. I wanted them to see the exact same man they had mocked, but I was no longer slouching. I sat perfectly straight, my hands resting calmly on the cold glass surface. Mr. Sullivan sat directly to my right, looking like a silent apex predator in a charcoal-tailored suit. He had a thick leather folder resting in front of him. At precisely 10 o'clock, the heavy mahogany door swung open. Stephanie and Justin walked in, radiating a toxic, suffocating energy. They were dressed as if they were attending a high-society gala. Stephanie wore a sharp white designer dress, and Justin was squeezed into a flashy pinstripe suit. They strutted into the room completely buzzing with the adrenaline of their impending victory. But they were not alone. Following closely behind them was Lawrence. Justin had actually brought his wealthy, arrogant father to witness his supposed financial salvation. I immediately understood the psychology behind this move. Justin was a desperate man who had been utterly humiliated when Lawrence refused to bail him out. Now that Justin believed he was about to seize absolute control of my assets and save his collapsing real estate empire, he wanted an audience. He wanted to look his father in the eye and prove that he had found a way to win. He wanted Lawrence to watch him conquer his massive debts. He was using my stolen life as a trophy to win back his father's approval. Lawrence walked into the conference room with a look of profound boredom. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and glanced around the understated office with obvious disdain. He looked at me sitting at the head of the table and offered the exact same dismissive nod he had given me at the steakhouse. He clearly believed he was attending a pathetic administrative meeting for a poor old mechanic. He took a seat near the back of the room, crossing his legs and checking his heavy gold watch, making it abundantly clear that his time was far more valuable than anything happening in this building. Stephanie and Justin took their seats directly across from me. The massive glass table stretched between us like a battlefield. Stephanie immediately launched into her performance. She plastered a sickly sweet smile across her face and leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. She asked me how I was feeling this morning, her voice dripping with that same patronizing tone she reserved for confused toddlers. She did not wait for my answer. She quickly reached into her designer handbag and pulled out the thick manila folder containing the power of attorney documents. She placed the folder on the glass surface and patted it gently. She told me she had everything organized and ready to go so we could get this boring insurance paperwork out of the way. She glanced over at Mr. Sullivan, expecting to see a disorganized, low-level attorney she could easily manipulate. Instead, she met the cold, dead stare of a man who dismantled corporate empires for sport. Mr. Sullivan did not smile. He did not introduce himself. He simply watched her with an unblinking analytical focus that made the fake smile on Stephanie's face falter for a fraction of a second. Justin tried to fill the sudden uncomfortable silence. He leaned back in his leather chair, resting his arm over the backrest, projecting total, manufactured confidence. He looked back at his father, flashing a smug, victorious grin. Then he looked at Mr. Sullivan and told him they were on a very tight schedule today. Justin instructed my lawyer to just show me where to sign so they could process the medical updates and get me back home to rest. He spoke with the commanding arrogance of a man who believed he owned the entire room. I looked at Justin leaning back in his chair, oozing false superiority. I thought about the 4 agonizing years I spent freezing on that warehouse loading dock, so his future wife could walk onto her college campus without a care in the world. I thought about the second mortgage I took out on my home to buy the extravagant wedding he and Stephanie used to impress the very man sitting in the back of this room. Lawrence was sitting there judging the quality of the office furniture, completely unaware that his son's entire adult life had been subsidized by the calloused hands of the mechanic he so openly despised. The sheer audacity of their presence here today was breathtaking. They had brought the ultimate audience to witness my execution. Stephanie tapped the manila folder again, her voice rising an octave with suppressed panic. She asked me if I was feeling confused again, offering to read the documents out loud if my eyes were too tired. She was desperately trying to maintain the narrative that I was a declining old man in need of her merciful intervention. She wanted Lawrence to see her as the responsible, dutiful daughter, stepping up to manage a difficult burden. It was a flawless piece of acting, driven by the absolute terror of the financial ruin waiting for her if I did not pick up the pen. I kept my hands resting calmly on the table. The silence stretched out, becoming a physical weight pressing down on their chests. Justin dropped his smug posture and sat forward, his brow furrowing in irritation. He asked me what the problem was, telling me to stop wasting everyone's time. His mask was slipping, revealing the desperate, cornered animal hiding just beneath the surface. I let him stew in his own rising panic. The meeting had completely assembled. All the players were locked in the room. The absolute peak of their arrogance had been reached, and the descent was going to be rapid, devastating, and utterly final. The silence in the conference room stretched until it felt like the heavy glass table might actually shatter from the pressure. Stephanie could not handle the quiet. Her fabricated patience completely evaporated, leaving only raw, frantic desperation. She grabbed the black pen resting on the table and forcefully pushed the manila folder across the smooth surface. The thick paper slid until it touched my hands. She told me to just sign the bottom line so we could finalize the medical updates and go home. Her voice was sharp, lacking any of the fake sweetness she had used in my apartment. She glanced nervously at Justin, who was shifting his weight in his chair and wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. Lawrence sighed loudly from the back of the room, muttering something under his breath about incompetent people wasting his valuable morning. I looked down at the fraudulent documents designed to end my life as a free man. I did not reach for the pen. I placed my fingertips against the edge of the manila folder and slowly, deliberately pushed it back across the glass until it rested directly in front of her. Stephanie opened her mouth to argue, her face flushing with sudden angry color. Before a single word could escape her lips, Mr. Sullivan moved. He did not speak a word of warning. He simply reached down beside his chair and lifted a massive, heavy black leather folder onto the table. The sound of the thick leather hitting the solid glass echoed like a gunshot in the sterile room. He unclasped the metal lock and flipped open the cover. The documents inside did not look anything like medical insurance forms. They were dense legal contracts printed on heavy bonded paper, bearing the official watermarks and seals of the city financial district. Mr. Sullivan did not look at Stephanie. He focused his cold, predatory gaze entirely on my son-in-law. With fluid professional precision, Mr. Sullivan extracted a thick stack of papers and slid them across the table, stopping them precisely in front of Justin. He instructed Justin to examine the top document. Justin leaned forward, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. He looked down at the paper. I watched his eyes scan the first few lines. I watched the exact second his brain processed the legal terminology printed on the page. The color drained entirely out of his face, leaving him the shade of dirty, wet ash. His mouth fell open slightly, and his hands began to tremble so violently the heavy glass table vibrated. He looked up at Mr. Sullivan with wild, terrified eyes. He stammered, asking how my lawyer had obtained highly classified internal documents regarding his commercial real estate development. Mr. Sullivan folded his hands, resting them perfectly still on the table. His voice was completely flat, carrying zero emotion. He informed Justin that the document he was holding was not a confidential internal memo. It was a legally binding notice of transfer. Mr. Sullivan explained that as of yesterday afternoon, the primary debt notes for Justin's failing commercial office building had been purchased in full. He detailed how the private, ruthless lenders who had been threatening to seize Justin's personal home had been bought out entirely. He did not stop there. He slid a second heavy document across the glass. He announced that the deed to the commercial property itself had been legally transferred to a private holding company after Justin defaulted on his final grace period. Justin physically recoiled from the papers as if they were covered in acid. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. The reality of his absolute financial ruin was sitting right in front of him, printed in black ink. He turned his head frantically, looking back at his father. Lawrence was no longer lounging in his chair looking bored. The wealthy patriarch was sitting bolt upright, staring at the documents on the table with a stunned, calculating expression. Justin looked back at Mr. Sullivan, his voice cracking as he demanded to know what was happening. He yelled, asking who bought his debt. He demanded the name of the anonymous holding company that had just swallowed his entire miserable empire in one single bite. Mr. Sullivan did not answer him. The lawyer simply turned his head and looked calmly at me. Every single eye in the room followed his gaze. Stephanie was staring at me, her mouth hanging open, her mind completely unable to process the legal assault happening in front of her. Justin looked at me, his eyes wide and pleading for an explanation. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold glass table. I looked directly into Justin's terrified eyes. I kept my voice incredibly soft and remarkably steady. I told him that I was the holding company. I told him that the Diane Baxter Memorial Trust was the anonymous entity that had purchased his suffocating debts. I watched the words hit him like physical blows. I did not raise my voice and I did not gloat. I delivered the truth with the clinical precision of a surgeon cutting out a disease. I explained that I had bought the notes from his ruthless private investors, paying them in cash. I told him I had acquired the absolute deed to his commercial high-rise. I watched his mind snap as he desperately tried to reconcile the fragile old mechanic he despised with the absolute financial titan sitting across from him. I told him he was no longer indebted to faceless banks or angry private equity firms. I told him that as of 9 o'clock this morning, I was his sole creditor. I was his absolute landlord. I owned the building he pretended to develop. I owned the massive debt he could never repay. I owned every single piece of his fake, fraudulent life. The silence that engulfed the conference room was absolute and suffocating. Stephanie looked wildly between her husband and her father-in-law. Her brain was violently rejecting the impossible reality unfolding before her. She stammered, asking how a retired suburban mechanic could possibly buy millions of dollars in commercial debt. Justin was entirely speechless. He sat paralyzed in his expensive pinstripe suit, staring at the man whose cheap clothes he had mocked just days ago. Lawrence slowly stood up from his chair in the back of the room. The arrogant patriarch who had told his son to be a man was staring at me with a profound, unmistakable expression of pure shock. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted. It had been completely obliterated and rebuilt from the ground up. I sat at the head of the table, no longer a ghost, watching my son-in-law realize that he was completely and entirely at my mercy. The realization hit Stephanie with the violent force of a physical strike. I watched her eyes dart frantically between the legal documents resting on the glass table and my calm, steady face. Her mind was struggling to process the impossible mathematics of the situation. She knew my pension. She knew the value of my modest apartment. She knew I did not possess the millions of dollars required to purchase commercial real estate debt. The gears in her head grinded together until they finally caught. She remembered the date. She remembered the cheap greeting card. She remembered the $5 quick pick. Stephanie leaped out of her leather chair so fast it slammed hard into the glass wall behind her. Her designer heels scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. She pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my chest. Her voice completely lost its refined country club polish, mutating instantly into a shrill, hysterical shriek that echoed terribly through the sterile room. She screamed that the money belonged to her. She screamed that she was the one who bought that ticket at the gas station with her own money, and that giving it to me was just a massive mistake. She slammed her hands down on the table, demanding that I transfer every single cent into Justin's business accounts immediately to save their house. She justified her explosive greed by crying that the money was always meant for her family, and that I had absolutely no right to keep it. Mr. Sullivan did not even blink at her violent outburst. He calmly opened another section of his heavy leather folder and extracted a single sheet of paper. He spoke with a voice so low and measured that Stephanie was forced to stop screaming just to hear him over her own frantic breathing. He addressed her not as a grieving daughter, but as a hostile, aggressive claimant. He explained the fundamental legal principles of gift law with the clinical precision of a surgeon. He told her that the exact moment she voluntarily relinquished physical possession of that lottery ticket, without a legally binding written agreement outlining the division of potential proceeds, it became my absolute and sole property. My lawyer did not raise his voice, but his words suffocated her hopes completely. He casually mentioned that any attempt to sue the trust for the funds would not only be immediately dismissed by any judge in the state, but would also result in her paying all of our exorbitant legal fees. He looked her dead in the eyes and told her that the $190 million was legally protected, shielded by an impenetrable corporate trust, and utterly beyond her reach forever. She had surrendered a vast historic fortune entirely on her own free will just to make a cruel joke at a steakhouse. Stephanie gasped for air as if she had been violently shoved underwater. She turned her wild, panicked eyes to Justin, begging him to say something to fix the nightmare. But Justin was completely paralyzed. He was staring blindly at the debt documents that proved I owned his entire life. He could not protect her because he could not even protect himself. In the back of the room, Lawrence was watching his daughter-in-law with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. The wealthy patriarch finally saw the pathetic, desperate reality of the woman his son had married. I decided it was time to end the performance entirely. I pushed my chair back slightly and sat up perfectly straight. I stopped the slight manufactured tremor in my hands. I stopped looking confused and weary. The frail, vulnerable old man they thought they were manipulating evaporated into thin air. I looked my daughter directly in the eyes. I let all the weight of my 71 years, all the authority of a father who had sacrificed everything, settle into my voice. I told her that I knew exactly why she brought those power of attorney forms to my apartment. I told her I knew she never cared about my medical insurance. Stephanie tried to deny it. She shrank back from the table, stammering out a pathetic, desperate lie. She claimed she was only trying to protect my health because my memory was fading and my mind was slipping. She tried to maintain the illusion of the caring, devoted daughter one last time, hoping to save face in front of her wealthy father-in-law. I reached into the inside pocket of my navy blue suit. I pulled out my smartphone and set the volume to its absolute maximum level. I placed it flat on the center of the cold glass table, and I pressed play. The audio was crystal clear. The recording I had captured from the dark shadows of my narrow hallway filled the quiet conference room. Everyone heard Justin's cold, calculating voice explaining exactly how they would hire a corrupt concierge doctor to forge a medical diagnosis of severe dementia. Everyone heard Stephanie readily and eagerly agreeing to the sinister plan. The room listened in absolute horror as my daughter coldly justified locking her own father in a substandard, restrictive psychiatric facility just to get her hands on his money. They heard her say that I was old anyway, and that a cheap nursing home was the safest place for me, while they used my fortune to save their fake empire. The sound of her own treacherous voice bouncing off the glass walls completely destroyed her. Stephanie collapsed back into her chair, covering her face with both hands as a loud, ragged sob tore through her chest. Justin stared down at his lap, his jaw slack, his entire body radiating profound, undeniable shame. Even Lawrence looked physically sickened by the sheer depravity of what he was hearing. The arrogant patriarch realized that his son and daughter-in-law were not just financial failures. They were absolute monsters, willing to commit premeditated elder abuse to maintain a country club lifestyle. I reached out and stopped the recording. The heavy silence that followed was absolute. I looked at Stephanie trembling behind her hands and told her that my memory was absolutely perfect. I told her that I had never forgotten a single thing in my entire life, especially not the brutal sacrifices I made so she could succeed. I told her I knew she planned to steal my freedom and throw me away like garbage. The absolute moral bankruptcy of her existence was laid bare for everyone in the room to witness. She had absolutely nowhere left to hide. I watched my daughter shatter into a million jagged pieces right in front of me. The realization that she had personally orchestrated her own absolute financial and social destruction was suffocating her. She clutched the edge of the glass table, her chest heaving as she desperately searched for a way out of the nightmare. Justin was completely broken beside her. He looked at the legal documents resting on the table, the irrefutable proof that I was his sole creditor, his landlord, the complete master of his failing empire. He opened his mouth to beg, but the words simply died in his throat. He had nothing left to leverage. His arrogance was entirely bankrupt. Lawrence, the wealthy patriarch who had despised me from the very beginning, stood up from his chair in the back of the room. He did not offer his son a shred of comfort. He looked at Justin with pure, unadulterated disgust. He walked toward the massive wooden door, pausing just for a second to look back at me. He gave me a slow, calculating nod of genuine respect before walking out of the room, entirely abandoning his son to the financial slaughterhouse. I turned my attention back to my son-in-law. I kept my voice incredibly soft and remarkably steady. I told Justin that as the new owner of the primary debt notes for his commercial high-rise, I was officially calling in the loans. I informed him that because he was currently in profound default, he had exactly 30 days to produce the $2 million, or I would seize every single asset tied to his company, including the home he currently lived in. I did not stop there. I pushed a second folder across the glass table. I told him it was the official eviction notice for his corporate office space. I gave him exactly 72 hours to vacate the premises. Justin buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, ragged sob that echoed terribly through the sterile room. He was utterly ruined. The flashy real estate developer who mocked my frayed cuffs was going to be publicly destroyed, stripped of his wealth, his status, and his pride. Stephanie lunged across the table, grabbing my arm with frantic, sweaty fingers. She begged me not to do this. She cried that I was her father, that I loved her, that I had always sacrificed everything to protect her. She sobbed that if I took their house, they would be homeless, publicly humiliated, ruined forever. She pleaded with me to remember all the good times, all the love we shared when she was a little girl. I looked down at her desperate, trembling hands. I felt absolutely nothing. The deep paternal love that had driven me to work brutal night shifts on freezing loading docks was completely dead. I gently but firmly pulled my arm out of her grasp. I looked her directly in the eyes. I let all the weight of my 71 years, all the authority of a father who had given everything, settle into my voice. I told her she was absolutely right. I had loved her. I had sacrificed my body, my time, and my financial security to give her a perfect life. I told her I mortgaged the very roof over my head to buy the extravagant wedding she used to impress the very people who looked down on me. I told her I would have broken my own back to see her smile. But then I reminded her of the steakhouse. I reminded her of the exact moment she chose to humiliate the man who gave her everything, just to appease a husband who was using her and a father-in-law who despised her. I leaned forward, making sure she heard every single syllable of my final judgment. I told her she bought me a $5 ticket because she genuinely thought that was my exact worth. I told her she was wrong. I told her it was the exact price of my absolute freedom. I stood up from the glass table. I did not wait for a response. I did not need to hear her apologies or her desperate bargaining. The performance was officially over. I buttoned my outdated navy blue suit, the suit she had mocked, and I walked out of that conference room, leaving them completely trapped in the suffocating silence of their irreversible ruin. 6 months have passed since that morning in the conference room. I no longer live in the cramped suburban apartment. I bought a quiet, beautiful piece of land in the Pacific Northwest, far away from the toxic noise of the Chicago elite. Mr. Sullivan handled the total liquidation of Justin's assets, ensuring that my daughter and her husband faced the absolute legal maximum of their financial consequences. I used a significant portion of the $190 million to establish the Diane Baxter Foundation. It provides massive, comprehensive scholarships to working-class kids who want to attend trade schools and technical colleges. I am making absolutely certain that kids who work hard with their hen have the resources to build a genuine life without drowning in debt. I travel now just like Diane and I always dreamed of doing. I have seen the coast of Italy. I have watched the sun set over the mountains in Japan. I am completely free, unburdened by guilt, unbound by toxic obligations, and living the final years of my life in absolute, beautiful peace. If there is one profound truth I have learned from this entire ordeal, it is that boundless, unearned generosity does not automatically create love or respect. It often breeds a toxic, blinding entitlement. We spend our lives pouring everything we have into our families, believing that our sacrifices will eventually be repaid with genuine affection. But true character is revealed when people believe you have absolutely nothing left to offer them. It is devastating to learn that the people you love measure your worth by your utility. But recognizing that bitter truth is the only way to truly set yourself free. Never let anyone convince you that your sacrifices are worthless. If you found any value or comfort in my story, please consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts below.